Today I want to talk about body image, the way that the body is described in Scripture. If you happen to have a Bible with you, you can turn it over to 1 Corinthians, the 12th chapter is where we're going to be. You can look at it on your phone or your iPad if you have it that way as well. I'll give you a moment to get there. And as you do, I just wanted to share a story with you about a church that I was reading about. It was a new church plant in a new town, and they were getting things off the ground, and people started coming to Christ. It was really an amazing thing that was happening in this new church that was going on. Most of the people that were coming, they were brand new converts. They didn't know anything about this Jesus, and so it was an exciting time. Lots of things were happening. They had miracles even happening. Just a powerful time for them as they started this brand new church. But as sometimes happens, as it began to grow, different people were coming from different backgrounds, and some tension started rising in that church. There were just different things that were going on. There were some who were from one religious background, some from another religious background, and they were kind of arguing about how worship should be. They were even letting women in some of the leadership positions, and nobody had ever seen that before. And so they were kind of like, are we even allowed to do this? They would have picnics, and sometimes those who got there first, the picnic, they would go ahead and eat, and then when the time everybody else got there, some of the food was gone, and some things that were going great all of a sudden, what was so powerful was kind of, I guess, held in balance to, could they keep this thing together? And so the leader of the church began to write them and say, hey, here's some advice that I want to give you. As you start this new church out, here's some things that you need to consider when you're thinking about you as a church. And the guy who was writing was a guy named Paul. I want you to listen to what he had to say to those early Christians. We're going to start in verse number 12. As he tries to describe, give them this image of what it means to be in this new kingdom, this new way of living, this new way of thinking, this new way of ordering your life. He says it like this. He says, just as a body, though it's one, has many parts, but all its many parts form one body. So it is with Christ. For we were all baptized by one Spirit as to form one body, whether Jews or Gentiles, slaves or free. And we were all given the one Spirit to drink. Even so, the body is not made up of one part, but of many. He goes on, he says, now if the foot would say, because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body, it would not for that reason stop being a part of the body. And if the ear would say, because I am not an eye, I don't belong to the body, it would not stop for that reason being a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? If the whole body were an ear, where could the sense of smell be? But in fact, God has placed the parts in the body, every one of them, just as He wanted them to be. If they were all one part, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, but one body. He continues to stretch this just a little bit more. Listen at him. He says, the eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you, and the head cannot say to the feet, I don't need you. On the contrary, those parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. And the parts that we think are less honorable, we treat with special honor. And the parts that are unpresentable are treated with special modesty, while our presentable parts need no special treatment. But God has put the body together, giving greater honor to the parts that lacked it, so that there should be no division in this body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. If one part suffers, every part suffers. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. You see, this early church had started out, and there were some tensions that grew as these people were beginning to relate to each other. There was tension as they were trying to figure out, how do we live this whole living and loving like Jesus thing out. Look at some of the things that were going on that seemed to be some of the problems. The first one is this one is some factions started growing in the church. Paul had started this church and he had called some of his friends to help him with it. He goes off to another part. But one of the things he writes about early in this letter, he says, some of you think that Paul is the person. And some of them are going, well, Paul, he's the guy. And then others were saying, another guy named Apollos, he's who we belong to. Other people were saying, well, no, we like Peter. And still there was a fourth group that said, no, what we're after is Jesus. And all of this was causing some tensions as they were trying to figure out, who's really in charge, or what should we do, or which way should we go? Well, another thing that was going on in this early church was this one, is there were some moral failures that were happening. Things were getting a little bit crazy in this church. One of the things that was happening, and Paul writes about it, was that one of the guys in the church was actually sleeping with his dad's wife. And everybody was okay with that. In fact, they weren't just okay with it, they were kind of proud of the fact that they were allowing this to go on. And it was some odd things were happening in this church. Even there was people that were cutting in line for communion, if you will. In this early church, the way that they did it, there was more than just what we have, is those few moments here every Sunday where we have the bread and we have the juice and we remember what the Lord did for us. They actually had a full-blown meal. They called it the love feast, and they would get together and they would have this complete meal all around the idea of what happened for us on the cross through Jesus. Well, some of the wealthier people, they could get there earlier than those who had the working class or the slaves that were there. They had a hard time getting there on time. And so what began happening is they were having this large meal, and they were going ahead and eating, the people who got there first, they were eating the meal, and then they were passing around the wine. And then in fact, by the time that the whole group was together, hardly any food was left for those who were late, and those who got there early, they were drunk. It was some crazy things were going on in this early church. Another one of those things was they had a lot of spiritual competition that was going on. There was a lot of competition between who was the most spiritual people. Paul had written them and he had said, you don't come behind in any of the gifts. You guys are really good in this area. You excel in the spiritual gifts. And so lots of neat things were happening. People were getting healed. There were prophecies that were happening. There were miracles that were going on. There were people speaking in tongues. There was just all sorts of wonderful things. But then it almost started to be in a competition. Who is the most spiritual one of us all? And Paul writes to them and tries to sort some of these crazy things that were going on at the time. As I was reading this week, I was looking at these verses and reading the story about this new church that had started in Corinth, and it kind of made me say, I'm glad that we got ourselves together, aren't you? The church has come a long way in 2,000 years, hasn't it? Then I started thinking about, we still do have a few things that divide us, don't we? We still do have some of the things that would happen to cause us to maybe be some tensions for us too. And so I think the more things change, the more they really do stay the same. You think about some of the division that goes on in the church. The Methodists don't like the Baptists. The Baptists don't speak to the Catholics. The Catholics, they don't want to speak to the Presbyterians. And so often, there's so much division that happens in the church as people don't get along with each other. And or you say, the way we do church is better than the way that they do church. At our church, we're really spiritual and we've really got our act together. And divisions that shouldn't be there seem to be the rule too often in the church. I've heard of churches that have gotten in fights and splits because of the color of the carpet that they decided to have. I read about a church in Syracuse, New York a couple of years ago that they were having a business meeting on a Sunday afternoon that wound up lasting 3 hours, and during those 3 hours, the police were called 3 times. Actually, the police the third time came and they shut the meeting down. Now that's a business meeting. The church sometimes, man, I think we miss it. The church has, we do, it's honest, we have our differences. And I would love to just point to the church out there, but the truth is that it's a challenge even here locally at this place. You know, as we come from different religious backgrounds, at Easter time we did a survey that just, what kind of religious backgrounds do we have? And we found out that there's a lot of different backgrounds that we have. A lot of us are Catholic, a lot of us are Baptist, a lot of us are disciples of Christ, some of us are Presbyterian, some of us are Pentecostal. We come from lots of different places. You know, we have the first service and the second service. You know, that could be a point of tension. Sometimes you think, well, the music's too loud or the music's too mellow. That could be something that could cause some tension here. There could be lots of different ways that we could, instead of being pulled together, we could actually start pulling each other apart. Well, that was going on in this church. That was going on in this church in a major way. And so Paul writes to them and says, I've got a better image for you. Instead of focusing just on what we have in differences, let's talk about this body, who we are as God's people. And one of the things he writes about is we are one. He says, for we have all been baptized into one Spirit to form one body, whether we're Jews or whether we're Gentiles, whether we're slaves or whether we're free. You know, for us, we kind of understand that a little bit, but especially for this time. Jews didn't associate with Gentiles. It was just not what you did. And you would never find a slave to sit down at a meal with a free person. That's just not the way that things happen. And Paul comes along and says, I've got some good news for you. There's a better way to think about this life that you now have. This new way of being the people of God is you are one. And if you have some time this week, I would encourage you to take this one chapter, chapter 12 in Corinthians, and just see how many times that little word one pops up. Over and over again, Paul says, you know, there are different gifts, but there's one Spirit. There are different ways of doing things, but there's one Spirit, and we are one. And Paul greatly pushes this point. But in the middle of all of this, there's another thing that he says that I think is also quite important. He also talks, not only are we one, we are also quite diverse. You know, we're Jew, we're Gentile, we're slave, we're free. He says, even the body is not made up of one part, but of many. And so he brings this picture of this body together, and then he says, let's talk about this a little bit. And the first thing he does is he begins to talk about what I see in this idea of maybe I just don't quite belong. Maybe I'm not as important as other parts of the body. And so he begins to address maybe this feeling that we have of I'm kind of unimportant. And listen what he says. And as I was thinking about this, I thought, let me give you a visual, because around here we like to have visuals. And so I was going to get a Barbie doll and have it, you know, and we could talk about here's the body. And I thought, well, that really doesn't represent this church real well. And so I did this instead. Isn't the truth? We're shaped more like a potato than we are Barbie. You know, there's no doubt about it. And Paul begins to write. And he says this. He says, now, if the foot, or am I ahead of myself? Which one is it? Yes. Now, if the foot would say, because I am not the hand, I don't belong to the body. So, you know, it's as if the foot would come along and say, you know, I'm not part of this because I'm not a hand. I'm really not all of that valuable. Or if the ear would say, that eye thing is really, really, really wonderful. I wish I was an eye, but I'm not an eye. I'm just here. And he would say, well, things would be much better if I could just be at this part. It just, you can probably hear better. But I'm not in that part, and so maybe I'm not really all that important. And Paul says, no, that's not the truth. Just because you think you're unimportant, just because you think, if I'm not here, if nobody's really going to miss me, all those sort of things that sometimes come into our mind, that doesn't all of a sudden make you not a part of something important. You are indeed needed. And then he begins to talk about those who maybe on the other part of the group might have been saying, you know what? There are a few parts here that we could probably shed a few pounds. We could probably just let a few things go. And they're probably not as necessary as maybe a spiritual people. And look at what he says. He says, the eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you. Can't do that. And the head cannot say to the feet, I don't need you. He goes on and he says this, on the contrary, those parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. I want you to get that. Because remember, what Paul is trying to do here is say, hey, this is a new way of living. I know what society tells us. I know society tells us that there are certain superstars everywhere in every group, and those are the people that we really need to build up, and we need to make sure we take care of them. And Paul comes along and says, no, you don't understand. It's the weaker parts that are indispensable. You're in a new way of thinking. You've got to rethink the way that you live your life. It's the weaker parts that we can't do without. It's the ones that are, maybe we would just cover up a little bit because of our modesty that are even more valuable than the ones that you can see. And it reminded me of this guy who one time was with a group of people, and there was these kids that were on the side, and all of a sudden he stops and he says, hey, bring these kids a little bit closer to me. And he grabs one of them, puts them on his knee, and he says, this right here, this is the kingdom of God. And Jesus would go on and talk about how it's those who are on the outside now get the chance to be a part of something greater than themselves. And the whole idea is that every single part of us, the weak, the strong, all of us together make up this thing called the body. It was by God's design that you were made the way that you were made. It was by God's design that you were gifted the way that you are gifted. It was by God's design that Catholic would be with Baptist, and that the Methodist would be along Presbyterian, and that we would be this mix of lots of different people that are from different religious backgrounds and come from different social backgrounds, and that some of us are liberals, and some of us are conservatives, and some of us are old, and some of us are young, and some of us see things this way, and some of us see things that way. It's by God's very design. You've been brought into something greater than could ever be done on its own. It's by God's design. So he goes on, and I think the message for us even today is to learn to embrace and celebrate our diversity. Every Thursday night, about 30 adults come up here and about 30 kids. One of the cool things about those 30 adults is they come from about 5 or 6 different churches with one thing in mind, and that's to help a kid. Help a kid succeed who is struggling in school. Whiz kids. Every Wednesday night, 50, 60, 70 kids show up. People from the church every week bring in food. Feed those kids. Some of them are reffing basketball in here. Sometimes it gets a little bit crazy in here. Every fall, we start a soccer program that touches lots of people's lives. Every winter, we have a basketball and cheerleading program that touches more lives. Lots of different people touching lots of different lives along the way. And Paul would say, when one part rejoices, when one part celebrates, we all celebrate. Some of us are here and we're feeding the kids, and some of us are on Thursday nights where we're tutoring other kids, and some of us are taking care of basketball, or some of us are getting things together here on Sundays to have our coffee and have things ready whenever everybody shows up. In lots of different ways, we take our gifts and our talents, and together we do something powerful that touches people's lives. What if we were all the same? What if all of us were great basketball coaches? 30 kids' lives wouldn't be touched. What if all of us were great tutors? 60, 70 kids on a Wednesday night, their lives wouldn't be changed. What if all of us just wanted to do youth group? We wouldn't have the coffee that we have here in the morning to keep us awake. But all of us, in all of our diversity, we're one. And it makes a huge impact in the lives of people around us. Let's pray together.